Thank you so much. So, hey everyone, my name is Maria Lamardo. I am a digital design accessibility manager at CVS Health. And I'm also a Vue.js community partner, as well as a board certified assistant behavior analyst. And I'm also a accessibility advocate, which I absolutely love. Um, so today I'm here to talk to you about web accessibility and what is web accessibility. Well, the web is fundamentally designed to work for all people, whatever their hardware, software, language, location, or ability. And we are provided some guidelines that allows us to do that. But first, let's talk a little bit about population. Well, it's estimated that around 1 billion people live with disabilities worldwide, and that's an estimated 15% of the world's population, making them the world's largest minority. This also makes up for over $6 trillion in spending power for people with disabilities at the global market. Then there's also different types of disabilities, and here are a couple of them. We can have motor disabilities, where people might need to use technologies like voice recognition software or eye tracking or adaptive keyboard, or even head ones. We also have visual impairments that some people might need screen magnification or screen readers or braille. We also have cognitive disabilities where we might want to be careful with our use of language and any cognitive load for our users. And there are also auditory impairments, in which case we want to make sure that we're providing any captioning or scripts or transcripts or sign language in any video or media that we have. And there's a lot more to discuss here, but this is like a quick overview. And well, how do you get started if you want to have an accessible application? Well, you can start small. There are a lot of changes that you can make to a lot of projects to create, like to improve accessibility and make easy wins. There's also simple ways to improve the design of your content and making sure that you're carefully making layouts and content that is accessible. You can also make sure that you're using good semantics, as you can improve your content structure, which is used by accessibility and assistive technology to navigate your application. And of course, making sure that you're testing for keyboard access, as all interactive elements must be operable by a keyboard. And so here we start talking about the form elements and how we can make our forms accessible. So the HTML form element is used to create kind of a form for user input. And this can hold many different types of elements that are listed here. And we're going to be talking about a couple of these different types of elements that exist inside of a standard form. So let's quickly move on to some examples. So here I have an example of a very simple form structure. So all we have here is a input field that has a label of first name and a second input field that has a label of last name. So because this is a semantic form element, we can see that there's a form and then there's also a button. And if I start typing and filling out my information, so I'm typing my first name, Maria, and last name, Lamardo. And because I'm in the second input field currently, and because this is a form element, I can submit it by hitting the enter key from any of the key inputs. So you can see I'm hitting the enter key, and that did submit my form. One thing that I do want to call out is if we want to open this in CodePen, and I'll just change it like this. Let's change, instead of having a form element, what would happen if we changed it to a div? So we are expecting to be able to submit this form from any input and pressing enter. So right now, because I've changed the form into a div, that functionality no longer exists. Now I can't be in an input field and hit enter to submit. In fact, if I even hit the submit button, nothing happens. So let's go back and change it to a form element. We can see that even with that small change, as I try to submit, the form does submit even without any input, as long as we have that form element. So you could see by just having the correct semantics, you can have certain expectations for the user functionality. Now, another thing that this helps with is also You're also able to navigate all of the form controls with your screen reader. So right now I'm going to turn on my screen reader, and I am using a Mac. So I'm using VoiceOver, which is built into my Mac. So I can turn this on with Command F5.
VoiceOver on Chrome, form structure, Google Chrome incognito.
So now I can also quickly tab through all of the form.
Form, first name, last name, edit, submit, button.
But also, I can also navigate through all of my form controls with Command, Option, Control, and the letter J. So if I do that,
Form structure, form, selected. Form, last name, edit, submit, button. You are currently on VoiceOver off.
So you could see that you even allow certain keyboard shortcuts with using the proper HTML form element. Okay, so going back to our slides. So not only do we have to make sure that we're using the correct semantic elements, but we also want to make sure that our content structure is also accessible. So this includes like keeping labels and input fields that are corresponding close together to create that connection. So if we look at another example, so let's look at this one here. We can see that we have a phone number label. And then we have this kind of icon that is kind of intrusive in the middle of the way. It's kind of big. And then we have some text underneath that. And then we find our input field. So you can see that there's content between the input field and the label. And though I might be able to tell what information is expected in this input field, let's pretend that I was a user that needed to be, zoomed in at like, let's say 200%. And in fact, I'm going to just open this so that it's in view. And I'm going to go to even 400%, right? So you could see that I see the label up here, but now I'm kind of scrolling down for that input field. And now that I'm in the input field, I have no idea where that corresponding label is. So it's kind of making that connection really hard for me to figure out. So really, it's best to keep all of our form elements together. With that being said, we also want to be careful not to use CSS to move things visually in the page without changing the DOM order. For example, in this example here, I've created the same content. So you can see that we have the phone number label with the phone number input field. And right now the label is visually right on top of the input field. And then we see that icon and a bunch of text kind of on the right, but it is out of the way. So, hey, this kind of looks good to me. But let me go ahead and turn on my screen reader.
VoiceOver on Chrome, moving content with CSS, Google Chrome incognito window, accessible form, phone number, content, selected.
Okay, so now I'm going to be using VoiceOver QuickNav, which I can turn on by hitting both arrow keys together. So right arrow key and left arrow key.
QuickNav off, QuickNav on.
You could see how I can toggle that on and off. So if I have it on, I'm able to navigate through all of the elements in the DOM order with the arrow keys. So I'm just going to hit right.
Phone, image, phone number, heading level 1,
So
moving content with phone number.
We have that phone number label.
Phone, image. You are current at Vero EOS at.
But now the content kind of jumped from that phone number label all the way to the right to the icon. Now it's reading that like text.
Phone number, edit at Vero.
Now it's in the input field. So even though they're visually together, semantically, and in the DOM, these elements are actually far apart.
VoiceOver off.
And CSS was used to kind of float the content to the right. Although it's visually close and you can tell that correlation, we want to make sure that we're also structuring the content so that it follows that logical order. So instead of doing this with CSS, we might want to change the order of this icon and this paragraph in the DOM so that the label and the input field are truly next to each other. Let me see if there are any questions so far. Okay, perfect. Another thing that I want to call out is that we want to make sure that color is not the only representation or the only means to conveying any information for the user, and that the color that we do use in our application meets the color contrast. So let's take a look at some of those examples. So here, when we're providing instructions, let's take a look at this example. We have, again, a first name field and a last name field, and then we have a text that says red fields are required. And then we see that the first name field has an outline border of red. So the only way that users are able to tell which fields are required is if you were able to see the outline colored red. So right now we're using color alone to indicate required fields, which is not easy to do because not all users will be able to see that red coloring. And to give you a little bit of an example of that, here's a little chart, color wheel that I have. So on the left, we have a color wheel, so you could see all the colors. We have orange, pink, yellow, green, blue. And then on the right, we have 4 different color wheels. And they're actually the same as on the right, but on top you could see different types of color blindness. So the first one, you could see that the colors are a little bit skewed. You could even see the grayscale. You can't even see any of the colors there. So you can see that if you're trying to indicate meaning through the use of colors, it might not mean the same thing to a lot of users, right? Because color isn't perceived the same for everybody. So just keep that in mind. And if you are showing something in color, make sure that there's like a text alternative to that. So one good way to call out required fields would be to say something like fields with asterisks are required, and then providing that little asterisk at the end. That would be a good idea. Okay, another thing that I wanted to call out on this one, and I'll actually open CodePen here, is the use of the attribute required. So let me actually zoom in here. So here we have the first name and last name, which we have called out as both required fields. So if we're looking at our code, we can see that we have an input field for the first name, and that input field has both HTML5 required element and the ARIA required attribute set to true. So let's take a look at this functionality. If I have required fields and I'm using Chrome, so if I try to submit this form with empty fields, you could see that Chrome kind of has their own built-in validation that tells me, hey, fill out this field. And it knows that it's required. It doesn't allow me to submit my form until I fill that out. So if I fill out my first name and from here, I'm going to hit enter. And now it tells me, okay, my last name is also required. Please fill out this form. Let's now take a look at what happens if I just took out the HTML5 attribute for required from the last name. So the first name still has it. So if I try to submit not having anything on the first name, it does give me that validation. But since I've removed it from the last name, it does allow me to submit. So just to kind of show you that the HTML5 attribute does block or does add additional functionality depending on the browser that you're using, and it does block the forms to be submitted. If I was to remove this and inspect, I do want you to see what's happening kind of on the back end of this. Okay, let's just refresh really quick. Okay, so here it is. If I inspect the input field and look at the accessibility tab, I am looking for invalid user entry, which is set to true because this form has the HTML5 attribute of required. But if I were to remove that, you can see that that invalid user entry defaults to false, whereas the other input field that I have here, so like the first name one, it is the user entry is set to true. So it is invalid by default when you have that required attribute, where if you don't include that, then it is set to false and it does allow you to submit that form. So just to kind of keep in mind different functionality that you have based on those attributes and how browsers can block that submission. Another thing about colors is that we want to make sure that we're meeting, or we want to strive to meet 2.1 AAA if possible, but certainly AA. So for normal text, you want to make sure that to meet a AA, you want to make sure that your color contrast is 4.5 to 1. Whereas for large text, which is defined as 14 points or about 18 pixels or 18 points or larger. So that has to be a 3-to-1 ratio. Same for user interface. And I've actually added a nice color contrast link here, which looks something like this. So what this allows you to do is you can input different colors for the foreground color. So this is kind of like the text, the color of your text. So you could see here that as I update the color of the text, the examples on the right here update, and so do the tests for which WCAG standard they're passing. So this color combination is passing at a AA, whereas it's failing at AAA. And you can also change the color of the background, and you can see that both background color and text color can be changed. And they also show you the color of the user interface or any graphical objects that you might want to use in your application. You also want to make sure that those meet the color contrast. Okay. Going on to labels and instructions. Let's take a look at how we want to, or what is available out there for us to be able to label things. We can add additional naming with ARIA label, which provides an essential information about an object. And this is typically used when there is no visual indicator of anything. So for example, if we have an icon, we might want to add an ARIA label to this. Like if we have a modal and then there's like that little X button, you know, that button that has that little X to close the modal, we might add an ARIA label to say close. And then ARIA labeled by is kind of similar, but it establishes relationship between an object that already exists on the page by its ID. So let's take a look at an example of exactly what that means. So we have many labels. Let's take a look at these examples. I have two search fields here. I have a primary search input field and a secondary search input field. So here we have a label that I have visually hidden. Then I have an input field for search, and that is followed by a search submit button. And then the form element has a role of search. And let me just quickly talk. Well, let's go over this, and then I'll quickly talk about role and the landmark of role. But for now, we can see that this input field, although it has a label, it also has an ARIA labeled by. So let's go ahead and inspect and see what this is like. So in fact, let me open it in CodePen so we can inspect it a little bit easier. And let's go into full page view. So if I inspect the first element, the first input, I mean, and I'm actually going to zoom in over here, and I'm going to go to the accessibility tab inside of Chrome. So looking at this input field, we can see a couple of computer properties for that element. So you could see that it has an accessible name of search primary site-wide. And how that's happening is, well, we could see that there's no title, no ARIA placeholder, no label specified from the label yet, even though we have ARIA labeled by, and this is using the search ID. So the search ID is the label itself, right? So this is the search label, and then the search heading. So we're combining both the label and heading to create this naming. So for ARIA labeled by, you can pair multiple IDs to create a longer naming, or you can use one to pair with an existing content. So this is where search is coming from the label, and then primary site-wide is coming from that heading. So we grab the label and the heading. So another thing I want to point out, that would be an instance of where you want to use ARIA labeled by, but ARIA label, there's a case for using it something like this. And let me explain why that might be. Now there's different HTML elements that provide a way for assistive technology to kind of jump quickly through the page. And this is by the creation of landmarks. There's different landmarks that can be created. So if you're using an HTML5 header element, this would be equivalent to using a roll of banner, which is meant to hold any name of the website, maybe a title of the page and a logo. And you can see that there's multiple different ones like navigation or a role of main to hold the main content of the site. And if you look all the way down here, you see that there's one ARIA role that is role of search. However, there's no HTML5 element for that. So let's go take a look at how I've implemented this role of search. So as we saw here, there is a role of search in that form element. And if I actually turn on my screen reader for this,
Voiceover on Chrome, ARIA labels,
I can access all of the landmarks by,
landmarks menu,
well, by hitting Control, Option, and the letter U. And actually, I can't show you, but
mission space with 2 items,
yeah,
Chrome,
it's not
ARIA label,
coming into this screen. But what I'm seeing is like this
landmarks
gray
menu,
box, and I'm gonna hit down so you can kind of hear what is said.
main, search, 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 search,
So you could see that it's recognizing two search landmarks.
search,
This is one,
search,
and this is another one. However, they both have the same name. All I hear is search, search, search. So
voiceover off,
when I have multiple landmarks that are the same and they're recognized as the same element on the page, it's kind of confusing for me to recognize what is the meaning behind this search versus that secondary search. We visually can see that one is for like a site-wide search, and then the second one is to kind of search for accounts on that website, let's pretend. So one way to allow that distinction is to provide ARIA labels into that element. So if I go to the element that has that role and I say ARIA label equals, and I'm going to say site-wide, that way I know that that's the site-wide search. And I'm going to try again, turn on my screen reader.
voiceover on Chrome, undefined, frame, landmarks menu, site-wide search, search, site-wide search. You are currently in the voiceover menu, closing.
So now you saw that the first search is now identified as site-wide search,
Voiceover off,
just search. So ARIA labels can also be used to add additional naming to those landmarks. And you could also use ARIA labeled by as well, but that's just one use case. Okie dokie. So I also want to talk about when you're using labels, there's two ways to do it. You can have an explicit label and an implicit label. Setting an explicit label is when you have a label element followed by the input element, and they are paired with for and ID. So the label has the for, which matches the ID of the input field, yes. And then setting implicit labels is the same functionality, but it is implemented a little bit differently. So you actually wrap the label element and you wrap the input field that is corresponding. And you could see that there's no ID and there's no for. So there's no matching of ID with that for attribute. And then you just have the label inside that element as well. Now, I will say that though they behave differently and then the expectation is the same, the explicit labels are better supported than implicit labels. So whenever possible, try to have the two elements separated and then pairing them with the for and the matching ID. Are there any questions so far? Perfect. So let's talk a little bit about instructions. You want to also make sure that all of the instructions are close to the input field. Want to make sure that all of the instructions are very easy and clear for all of your users, and use the ARIA describe by to describe those input instructions if you're not including them in the label. ARIA describe by will provide kind of extended information that the user may need, and it works similarly to ARIA labeled by, where you're going to have to match the ID of that content. So let's take a look at what that means. So when we look at instructions for forms, there's different ways that I've seen this be implemented. So one common mistake that I see is the use of placeholders to provide either formatting or just helper text for users. So for example, in this first example, I have my name field, and then inside the name field, I have a placeholder that says first and last name. So that's information that I need to know, not just to put my first or last name, but I must include both. But as you can see, as soon as I start typing, that information goes away. So if I had to walk away from my desk and had to come back, I see Maria, I see name, I say, yep, that seems good to me. I'm gonna kind of move on and submit my form. And I have completely left out my last name. So I lost the content and the instructions that that provided for me. Not only that, not only does that content go away when I'm typing, but the default for placeholders does not meet the color contrast. So you could see that this is a little bit too grayed out. And if we actually change that color to meet the color contrast, so let's say that I make that color black, then it actually looks like pre-populated data, and I might just skip that field altogether. So it's best to just not use placeholder data, and it's not always picked up by all assistive technology. So I would instead opt for doing something like this, where you can have your instructions or helper text in the label itself so that it's available permanently and for all users. And also, you can also do aria describe by, where you can have a label, the input, followed by some sort of text that you pair semantically. So let's take a look at what that looks like in the code. So if we check here, we have our form, and then we have our input field with the label, and then there's some text that follows it, and we could see that that text has an ID of name description. Yeah, this is shorthand, and then you could see that that is the same that we are pairing with the aria described by in that input. So if we inspect this element, let's just see what our accessibility tab tells us about this element. So if we go here, we can see that it tells us that it has a computer property that has a name of name, which is coming from the label. Then it also tells us that it has a description that says first and last name. So you could see that that's actually coming from this. And we can see all of that information being picked up, even on the aria attributes. And if I were to turn on my screen reader, I do want to share with you how the aria describe is picked up.
Voiceover on Chrome, name edit text. First and last name, you are currently submit.
So I'm gonna step into it again, but just here for it, you're gonna hear the label, so name, and then it's going to kind of pause and then tell you the descriptive text.
Name edit text. First and last name, you are currently on a text field inside of a voiceover off.
So as you can see, I was able to hear both labels and that description text that I added with aria described by. Okay, perfect. We also have many input types that you can choose to use depending on the functionality that you need. And let us focus on input type of image, because that one is kind of interesting. So if we go down and let's find that example. Yeah, so we have some input image type, which is kind of a functional image. So if we take a look here, we have a form, we have a label that is visually hidden, we have an input for search, and then another input that has a type of image, and then it has a source for the image and an alt text of search. So let me inspect that element, and that element is this little icon here. So you could see that it's the input of type image. I'm going to inspect it, go to the accessibility tab. And what I find very interesting about this is if we go to the computer properties and we look at the role of that element, even though we have type image, this is actually picked up by assistive technologies as if it was a button. And in fact, if I were to, as we've discussed before, buttons do allow submission of forms. So if I just have some random text in this input field and I hit that button that has an input type of image, you could see that that actually does submit my form. So that it is functioning and behaving as a proper semantic button. And if we go down here, you can also see that another way to add an image, you can also wrap an image inside a button and have it that way. Another thing I want to discuss is the different types of buttons that can be inside of your forms. So as we discussed before, if you submit, so this is type of submit, it will submit your form like this. If you include a button that has a type of button, it will actually not do anything unless you add some JavaScript. So you could see I'm pressing this button that's just a type of button and nothing happens. If I press this button that has a type of reset, then it empties my form. So it empties out all of my input fields. And then if I hit submit, then it submits. Another thing I wanted to call out is if you have a button and you don't give it a type, right? So I'm just going to say no type. And it is wrapped inside of a form element. Then you could see that it also submits the form. So when you have buttons that are wrapped around a form element, it defaults to submit a type of submit. So if you have a button inside a form that you don't want it to submit your inputs, then make sure that you're adding type of button. Okay, so next, let's also talk a little bit about mobile, because those input types can also change up the functionality that those buttons, that those input types will have. And before we talk about mobile, actually, let me talk a little bit about this different input types. So we not only do we have input type of image, input type button, we also have, as we can see here, input type of things like checkbox and radio. So if we have radio, radio and checkboxes are pretty similar in that they will both have legends, right? And then they'll have like multiple options that are kind of iterated through. For radio buttons specifically, you have a combination of inputs and labels, and then the same thing will happen for the checkboxes. However, the only thing that really changes is the type. So let me just show you what the experience is like with a screen reader for both types. So for checkboxes, the expected functionality for keyboard is that you're able to tap to those options. And let's see what it
Angular,
reads.
tacos, whipped popcorn, apple, granola bar, leaving code pan embed, input types, entering code pan, input, mixed nuts, unchecked, Angular, tacos, React, popcorn, unchecked, checkbox. You are currently on a checkbox, types, select, granola bar, unchecked, checkbox. You are currently on a checkbox.
So we could hear that it reads like label, unchecked checkbox. So it tells us the status of it. And then it also told us
inside of a group to select.
Let me show you what happens if I start checking or unchecking and see how that's read. So I'm going to be able to check and uncheck with space.
Check,
and
granola bar, checkbox. Uncheck, check, granola bar, checkbox, mixed nuts, apple slices, check, apple slices, popcorn, mixed, granola bar, popcorn, Angular, popcorn, unchecked, checkbox. You are apple slices, checked, checkbox, mixed nuts, granola bar, checked, checkbox. You are currently.
All right, now let's take a look at how radio buttons are picked up. For radio buttons, I'm able to tab to the choice once, and then using the arrow keys, I'll be able to move around in the choices.
Mixed apple, popcorn, Angular, radio button, 1 of 3. You are currently on a radio button. Vue, selected radio button. React, selected radio button, 3 of 3. You are currently on a radio button. Voiceover off.
And I will also check out. If we are inspecting, we can also see input field. And then you could see that it's part of that group for choose a framework. And then the legend is being grabbed from choose a framework. And you can see that. Okay. Let me just close this. Okay, so when we're looking at mobile, I've included some different types of input fields here, so you can play around with them in your mobile web. However, since I don't have that connected yet, I have provided some input, some screenshots of different input types across different mobile screens. So here, when we have input type of text, you have a normal keyboard come up. If you have an input type of number, you can see that only the numbered keyboard comes up. And you could see that that's different than the type of telephone. As you can see that the telephone also provides those letters that correspond to the numbers. And then you can have a different keyword that pops up for color. Then, of course, you also have different types of input of keywords coming up for different types of months, type of week, and type of date time. And again, this will behave differently depending on what type of device you're using. Okay, so looking at autocomplete attributes, there is a full list of what type of attributes are available. So you can see that there are a lot. There's name, there's given name, there's family name, nickname. A lot of them are available for addresses, depending on how you break them down in your application. So you could see that there are a lot. So we want to make sure that we are matching those autocompletes to the purpose of the certain input field. And you could set them in the entire form or individual input fields. And this will help people with cognitive disabilities and just a lot of other improvements to your application as well, because people are going to also be able to fill out a lot of your forms a lot faster and move through your process. So looking here, you can set, I actually have my auto complete off for security purposes during screen sharing. But if you want to take a look at this one, you can see that as soon as you hit this first name and last name, that should auto populate if you have those saved in your browser. And you could actually set them on an input level, like you can see here. So this input, let's see. Yeah, let's see, you can set them form level like I do here. So autocomplete on in the whole form, or you could do autocomplete per input. So for my first name, I have autocomplete of given name. And for my last name, I actually did not add one for last name, but you could see the first name. And if you wanted last name, if we go back to that list, then I would say something like family name, which you could see is the equivalent of last name. So that's how I would go about finding that. So there are a lot of considerations for building accessible forms, and I didn't get to cover everything today, but I really encourage you to kind of go through all of the docs and explore different types of input fields and different input types, and just turn on your screen reader and test it out. So here I've shared the slides on the chat here, but on the slides, you'll also find the slides for the code snippets that I've shared. So this presentation here. And then there's a color oracle, which allowed me to share the different color blindness with that color wheel. And then Chromebox, which is a free screen reader used on Chrome as a Chrome extension. And then all of the different ARIA roles, states, and properties that exist, in case you're interested, particularly around the landmarks role. Those are pretty nice. Another thing I wanted to mention before we kind of wrap up is the use of auto tabbing. And I've seen this used a couple of times where, let's say that I am typing a phone number and then see I'm not tabbing, it just kind of auto tabs for me so that I can continue on to the next field. I've seen this a couple of times, and this isn't the best experience because I, as a user, I'm also expecting to tab. So whenever I'm actually encountering something like this in like production, I actually start doing this, and then I tab, but then this program also tabs, so I end up in the place where I'm not supposed to be, which can be very disorienting. So it's best to allow users to tab to different input types themselves, to different input fields themselves, and not introduce any unexpected behaviors that the users didn't trigger themselves. Okay, that is all I had for today. If you have any questions, feel free to post them here in the Q&A, or reach out to me on Twitter at Maria Lamardo.
Maria, thank you so much. You have me wondering, like, if I need to go through my project's website now and like send it to our webmaster and be like, hey, can you make sure all this is correct? It's such good information. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Does anyone have any questions? We have about 4 minutes left, I believe. Um,
Let's see.
do have some comments coming in.
Oh, thanks, Fred.
I think this presentation, Maria, is just so packed with so much information that you think about, but this makes you consciously really think about it and really plan for accessibility and what people um, maybe you don't have those challenges yourself, but chances are you probably know somebody who does, and it makes you really think about it. So um, I had a question that's not really related to um, um, the presentation exactly, but oftentimes people who have a passion for this, there was some moment in time or some event that triggers that passion. Was there something like that that triggered this for you?
So it's actually kind of interesting. So I'm a board certified assistant behavior analyst, and I provided behavioral therapy for people with developmental disabilities for about 8 years before I moved into development. So I moved into development for health reasons. I had to kind of work remotely, and I that's kind of how I moved into development. And I was like, I can do this from home, okay. And as I discovered web accessibility, I was like, wow, this is awesome. This is like what my whole previous career was fighting against, because I had all of this patients that had all of these devices, and we struggled to find not only devices that were accessible and that we could carry and we could function, but then applications that were accessible. Forget it. It was incredibly hard, and so I had like a decade of experience of like all of these frustrations from so many people. And then when I kind of came into the tech side, I was like, oh my gosh, like I can help find all of these solutions and like help. So it's just interesting to kind of have that like perception and kind of switch it over.
I know one time I broke my hand and wasn't able to like use my hand, but I still had to work, and so I had to learn how to do stuff without using my
Mhm.
hands. And it was a little more difficult than I thought, and things and the organizations I was interacting with, I thought would have taken care of some of those issues, and we learned that they hadn't. And by me
Mhm.
breaking my hand and being vocal about it, I could do that. So there's always these triggers in people's lives that sort of create their passion. So I'm glad that you're really passionate about this, and I overuse that word all the time, but that you're really leading the charge on this and sharing this and empowering people to then go and empower their communities by making these changes to their sites and the way they think about creating these forms and other things. So
Yeah, yeah. It can be easy if you kind of start looking at the concepts and like, oh yeah, this kind of all makes sense. This functions as intended. Yeah. I see one question from Ingrid. Is Lighthouse still a good use to check accessibility? So yes, I actually use the Lighthouse tool when I'm actually going to, since I'm sharing my screen still. So the Lighthouse tool is actually built into Chrome. So if you open your DevTools in Chrome and go to the Lighthouse tool, there is an accessibility audit that you can run in. This actually runs in Axe, and you could even choose what type of device you want to run your report. But let's say that I'm going to run a report on webaim.org. So when you run the report, this will give you an overall accessibility score. Again, this will only catch about like, I don't know, 30% of the accessibility issues that could exist in your site. So just keep that in mind. This isn't a all-inclusive accessibility check, but it does tell you and teach you about some of the things that they did check for, how they passed, why they passed, and some of the things that you might want to check manually. So these are just even good information. This is just really good information just to have and to start learning about how to test for those accessibility um, pieces in your application.